The Texas sun bled orange across the horizon, casting long, melancholic shadows over the porch railing where George Strait sat, his weathered hands resting on the knees of his faded denim jeans. The silence of the ranch was not empty. It was full of memories, the kind that settle into the wood of the rocking chair and the dust of the driveway. George took a slow sip of his iced tea, the condensation on the glass cold against his fingertips, contrasting with the lingering heat of the late afternoon. He looked out past the fence line, watching a hawk circle lazily in the thermal currents. This was his kingdom, not the stage with the blinding spotlights or the arenas filled with screaming fans, but this quiet patch of earth where the wind whispered through the mesquite trees. At 71, George had seen everything the world had to offer, a man with a guitar and a voice that could melt stone. He had shook hands with presidents, played for kings, and traveled more miles than a long-haul trucker. But his heart always returned here, to this porch, and to the woman who was currently moving around inside the kitchen. The screen door creaked open, a sound as familiar to George as the opening chord of a Marilou by morning. Norma stepped out, wiping her hands on a checkered dish towel. Her hair was silver now, shining in the dying light, but her eyes held the same spark they had in high school, the same fierce intelligence and unwavering loyalty that had anchored him when the waves of fame tried to pull him out to sea. She didn't say anything at first, just walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. The weight of her hand was a grounding force. George reached up and covered her hand with his own, squeezing gently. They didn't need words. After 5 decades, silence was a language they spoke fluently. Tomorrow, they would leave for Las Vegas. The T-Mobile Arena awaited, sold out for 2 nights. 20,000 people each night, traveling from all over the country, some saving their paychecks for months just to sit in the nosebleed section and hear him sing about cowboys and heartbreaks. It was a responsibility George took seriously. He never phoned it in. He owed them his best, every single time. But tonight, looking at the sunset, he felt a strange heaviness in his chest, a nostalgia that was almost painful. He looked at Norma, really looked at her, tracing the lines on her face that mapped out their journey together. The lean years, the years of beans and rice, the years of uncertainty when Nashville slammed doors in his face and told him he was too traditional, too old-fashioned. "Do you remember that winter in '76?" George asked softly, his voice a low rumble that barely disturbed the air. Norma smiled, a wistful expression crossing her face as she leaned against the railing. "I remember it. It was cold," she said, "and I remember we were broke." George chuckled, a dry sound. "Broke doesn't even cover it." "Norma, we were so far down we had to look up to see the bottom. I was ready to quit. I was ready to sell the truck and take that job at the cattle pen full-time. If it hadn't been for that lottery ticket you found." He trailed off, shaking his head in disbelief, even after all these years. It was the cornerstone of their family legend, the miracle of 1976. George had come home from a failed audition to find his prized Gibson Dove guitar missing. Stolen, he had assumed, taken from the back of their unlocked sedan while he was inside a gas station. He had been devastated. That guitar was his voice. Without it, he was just a man in a hat. He had sat at the kitchen table, head in his hands, weeping dry, angry tears. 2 days later, Norma had burst through the door, waving a scratch-off lottery ticket and a wad of cash. She had won $500, she said, enough to buy a replacement. Not just any replacement, but a better model she had found at a music store in San Antonio. She had saved his dream. That guitar, the one she bought with the lottery money, became his Excalibur. He had written his first #1 hit on it. He played it every night. It was sitting in its velvet-lined case right now, packed and ready for Vegas. Norma turned away slightly, looking out at the darkening pasture. "We did what we had to do, George," she said, her voice uncharacteristically tight. "We survived." George patted her hand again. "We did more than survive, honey. We thrived. And I owe it all to that lucky streak of yours." He stood up, his knees popping, and stretched his back. "I'm going to turn in early. Big day tomorrow." Norma nodded, but she didn't follow him inside immediately. She stayed on the porch, watching the sun disappear completely, leaving the world in a bruised purple twilight. If George had looked back, he might have seen the shadow of an old burden crossing her face, a secret she had carried for half a century, heavy as a stone in her pocket. The flight to Nevada was smooth, the private jet cutting through the clouds like a silver needle. George spent the flight reviewing the set list with his tour manager, a frantic man named Jimmy who lived on coffee and anxiety. Jimmy was excited about a new element for the show. "We've got this incredible retrospective video package, George," Jimmy said, tapping on his tablet. "The video team has been scouring archives, fan submissions, old newspapers. We're going to project it on the massive LED wall during the acoustic set. It's going to be a tearjerker, real emotional stuff." George nodded absently, looking out the window at the desert landscape below. "Sounds fine, Jimmy. Just make sure the sound mix is right. I don't want the fiddle getting buried during the bridge of the chair." Jimmy assured him it would be perfect. They arrived in Las Vegas in the early afternoon. The city was a beast that never slept, a neon oasis of excess. The heat hitting them as they stepped onto the tarmac was different from the Texas heat. It was dry, aggressive, smelling of asphalt and jet fuel. A convoy of black SUVs whisked them away to the arena. George held Norma's hand the entire ride. She seemed quiet, paler than usual. He asked if she was feeling all right, and she blamed a headache, asking for some aspirin and a dark room once they got to the venue. George kissed her forehead, worried but focused on the job ahead. He was a professional. Personal worries had to be compartmentalized until the final encore was sung. Backstage at the T-Mobile Arena was a labyrinth of concrete corridors, road cases, and scurrying crew members. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and hairspray. George retreated to his dressing room, a sanctuary of calm amidst the chaos. His wardrobe hung in the corner, a pristine pressed shirt and his signature Wrangler jeans. On a stand in the center of the room sat the guitar. The Gibson. The wood was worn in places where his arm had rubbed against it for decades, a testament to thousands of hours of practice and performance. He picked it up, strumming a G chord. The sound was rich, warm, and resonant. It sounded like home. A young guitar tech, a kid named Travis who couldn't be more than 22, knocked on the door and poked his head in. "Mr. Strait, 5 minutes to sound check." George nodded. "Come on in, son. You ever hear the story of this guitar?" Travis shook his head, eyes wide with reverence. "No, sir." George smiled, running his hand along the neck of the instrument. "This here is the guitar that built the house. Back in '76, my original was stolen. I was flat broke. My wife, Norma, she found a scratch-off ticket in the grocery store parking lot. Won $500. She went out and bought this for me. If she hadn't found that ticket, I'd be selling insurance right now." Travis grinned. "That's amazing, sir." "Fate." George nodded. "Fate. Or just a good woman." The sound check went without a hitch. The band was tight, a well-oiled machine. The lights dazzled. The massive screen behind the stage tested its pixels, flashing colors and patterns. George didn't pay much attention to the video content. He trusted his team. He was focused on the monitor mix, making sure he could hear the steel guitar clearly. After soundcheck, he went back to the dressing room. Norma was there, sitting on the sofa, staring at her hands. She looked up when he entered, forcing a smile. "You sounded great, George." He sat beside her. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." She laughed nervously. "Just the lights. They're brighter than I remember." George put his arm around her. "It's just another show, babe. We've done a million of them. Just you and me." The hours ticked by. The arena filled up. From the dressing room, they could hear the low roar of 20,000 people, a sound like the ocean during a storm. The opening act played, warming up the crowd. Then the house lights went down. The roar became a deafening scream. George stood in the wings, adjusting his hat. He took a deep breath, centering himself. He looked at Norma, who was standing by the monitor desk. "I love you," he mouthed. She mouthed it back, blowing him a kiss. He walked out into the spotlight. The first hour of the show was electric. George moved through the hits with the ease of a man walking through his own living room. Check yes or no. Write this down. Oceanfront property. The crowd sang every word, their voices blending with his. He felt the energy, the love, the connection. It was a spiritual experience. He was the high priest of honky-tonk, and this was his congregation. Then came the acoustic set. The band stripped back. The drummer switched to brushes. The lights dimmed to a soft golden hue. George sat on a stool center stage, the Gibson resting on his knee. This is the part of the show where we like to look back a little bit. George told the audience, his voice echoing through the massive sound system. "We've been doing this a long time, and we couldn't have done it without you." The crowd cheered. Behind him, the massive LED screen began to display the retrospective video Jimmy had promised. George started playing the opening chords of a ballad, a song about enduring love and hard times. As he sang, images floated across the screen behind him. Black and white photos of his early days in local bars. Polaroids of the tour bus in the 80s. Newspaper clippings of his first #1. The audience watched, mesmerized by the history unfolding before them. George couldn't see the screen, it was behind him. He was lost in the music, closing his eyes as he sang the bridge. But then, something changed in the room. It wasn't a sound exactly, it was a shift in the atmosphere. A collective gasp from 20,000 throats, followed by a sudden confused murmur. The cheering stopped. The singing along stopped. A strange, heavy silence began to ripple outward from the front rows to the rafters. George sensed it immediately. He was a master of reading a crowd. He opened his eyes. He saw people in the front row pointing at the screen. He saw confusion on their faces. Some looked shocked. Some looked sad. He kept playing, professional instinct taking over. But he turned his head slightly to look at his bass player. The bass player had stopped playing. He was staring at the screen, his mouth slightly open. George looked at the wings. Jimmy, the tour manager, was frantically speaking into his headset, waving his arms at the video booth. Norma was gone. She had left her spot by the monitor desk. George stopped playing. The guitar chord hung in the air, unresolved. He turned around. The screen was massive, 40 feet high. Frozen on it was a photograph. It wasn't a promotional shot. It wasn't a newspaper clipping. It was a high-resolution scan of an old, battered photograph, likely found in the dusty archives of a defunct business, or submitted by a fan whose family had crossed paths with the Straits decades ago. The date stamped in the corner of the photo, in that distinct yellow digital font of the 70s, read NOV 14, 1976. The photo showed the interior of a shop. The shelves in the background were cluttered with used tools, radios, and jewelry. A sign above the counter read, Owl's Pawn and Loan, San Antonio. In the center of the frame stood a young woman. She was impossibly young, her hair long and unstyled. It was Norma. But it wasn't the happy, triumphant Norma who had waved the lottery ticket. This Norma was devastated. Her face was red and blotchy, her eyes swollen from crying. She was standing at the counter, her hands pushing a guitar case toward the pawnbroker. George recognized the case. He recognized the stickers on it. It was his original guitar, the one he thought had been stolen. But that wasn't the detail that made George's heart stop in his chest. That wasn't the detail that made the 20,000 people fall silent. The camera had captured the moment perfectly. Norma's left hand was resting on the counter, extended toward the pawnbroker as if she was pleading. Her fingers were bare. There was a tan line on her ring finger, a pale band of skin where a ring used to be. Beside the guitar case, sitting on the glass countertop, was a small, modest diamond ring, her wedding ring. The caption under the photo, likely added by the video team who thought it was just a poignant picture of struggle without knowing the context, read, "The Sacrifices of Love, 1976. George stared at the image. His brain tried to process what he was seeing. 1976. November. The same week his guitar was stolen. The same week she won the lottery. The pieces of the puzzle, scattered over 50 years, suddenly slammed together with the force of a freight train. There was no theft. There was no lottery ticket. There was no luck. There was only Norma. She hadn't found a winning ticket. She had taken his guitar, the only thing of value they owned, and she had pawned it. But why? To pay bills? No. He looked closer at the image on the giant screen, the receipt on the counter. It wasn't a pawn ticket for a loan. It was a bill of sale. She was selling it. And the ring. She had sold her wedding ring. George felt the blood drain from his face. The microphone in his hand felt like lead. He turned back to the audience, but he didn't see them. He saw 1976. He saw Norma coming home with the new guitar. He remembered her smile. He remembered asking her, "What about the ring? You're not wearing it?" She had told him she lost it down the sink drain while doing dishes and was too scared to tell him. He had believed her. He had been so happy about the guitar, so focused on his music, that he had just hugged her and said they'd buy a better one someday. She had lied. For 50 years, she had lied. She had sold her ring and his old guitar to get enough money to buy the better guitar, the Gibson Dove, the one he held in his hands right now. She had stripped herself of the symbol of their marriage to give him the tool he needed to build his career. She had walked around with a bare finger for 2 years until he made his first check and bought her a replacement, never knowing that the original wasn't in a pipe somewhere, but in a pawn shop display case sold to finance his dream. The silence in the arena was suffocating. George walked to the microphone. His hand trembled. He cleared his throat, but his voice cracked. "Ladies and gentlemen," he whispered, the sound amplified to the rafters. I need a minute." He unstrapped the guitar, the Gibson Dove. He looked at it with new eyes. It wasn't just an instrument anymore. It was a sacrificial altar. It was a monument to a love so fierce, so selfless, that it terrified him. He had walked around for half a century thinking he was a self-made man, or a lucky man. He wasn't. He was a man carried on the back of a woman who had sold her own happiness to buy his. He looked at the wings of the stage. "Norma?" he called out, forgetting the microphone, shouting into the void of the backstage darkness. "Norma?" The crowd began to murmur again. They realized they were witnessing something unscripted, something raw and painfully real. This wasn't a show anymore. This was a life unraveling and knitting itself back together in real time. George turned to the band. "Stop," he said. "Cut the click. Cut everything." He looked up at the screen, at the crying girl from 1976. He felt tears prick his own eyes. He had been a fool, a blind, selfish fool. He thought about every song he had written about love. They all seemed shallow now compared to the image on the screen. He thought about the times he had been on the road, leaving her alone to raise their son, thinking he was providing for the family. He was providing, yes, but the seed money, the foundation, it came from her finger. He walked to the center of the stage, the spotlight following him. He looked small in the vastness of the arena. He took the microphone off the stand. "Folks," he said, his voice gaining a little strength, though it was thick with emotion. "You see that picture? I've never seen that picture before in my life. I assume most of you know the story I've told for 40 years, about how my guitar was stolen, about how my wife won the lottery to buy me this one." He gestured to the guitar on the stand. "I believed that story," George said, a tear escaping and tracking through the deep lines of his cheek. "I believed it until 10 seconds ago." He turned and pointed at the screen. "That's my wife, Norma, in 1976. That's Al's pawn shop. She didn't win the lottery." He paused, choking back a sob. "She sold her wedding ring. She sold her ring to buy me my future." A collective "oh" went through the crowd, a sound of heartbreak and realization. Men in cowboy hats wiped their eyes, women clutched their chests. "She told me she lost it down the sink," George confessed, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And I believed her. I let her walk around without a ring for 2 years because I was too busy playing this guitar that she bought with her own heart." He looked at the wings again. The tour manager was pushing someone forward. It was Norma. She was reluctant, her face buried in her hands, shaking. She didn't want the spotlight. She never had. She had done it in the shadows, quietly, without asking for credit. That was who she was. "Norma," George said, his voice breaking completely. "Baby, please come out here." The distance from the wing of the stage to the center microphone was perhaps only 50 feet, but for Norma Strait, it looked like a canyon. It looked like the miles of highway between San Antonio and Nashville that they had driven in a beat-up sedan with no air conditioning. The tour manager, Jimmy, had gently placed his hand on her back, urging her forward, but her feet felt heavy, rooted to the floor by the weight of a 50-year-old secret that had just been projected onto a 40-foot screen. She wasn't a performer. She was the anchor. She was the one who stayed in the shadows while George stood in the light. But now the light was searching for her, cruel and exposing. George stood alone in the center of the arena. The neck of his guitar gripped so tightly in his left hand that his knuckles were white, matching the brim of his hat. He didn't look like the king of country music in that moment. He looked like a man who had just woken up to find his house had burned down while he was sleeping, leaving him standing in the ashes of his own ignorance. He watched her emerge from the darkness of the backstage area. She was wearing a simple, elegant black blouse and jeans, dressed for comfort, not for the eyes of 20,000 strangers. As she stepped onto the stage, the wooden floorboards vibrating with the suppressed energy of the crowd, a low murmur rippled through the arena. It wasn't applause. It was a sound of reverence, of collective breath-holding. They knew they were trespassing on a private moment, yet they couldn't look away. George took a step toward her, then stopped. He seemed afraid to touch her, as if the revelation had made her fragile, or perhaps holy. He lowered the microphone, but in the dead silence of the T-Mobile Arena, the acoustics carried his unamplified voice to the front rows, and the sensitive stage mics picked up the rest. "Norma," he said, his voice cracking like dry wood. The name hung in the air. She stopped a few feet away from him. Her eyes were red, mirroring the girl in the photograph looming behind them.
She looked up at the screen, then back at him.
Her expression a mixture of shame and defiance. "I didn't want you to know," she whispered, her voice trembling but audible through the sound system. "I never wanted you to know." George shook his head slowly, the movement heavy with confusion. He raised the microphone to his lips again, addressing her, but letting the world hear the conversation. "Why?" he asked, the words stretching out, filled with pain. "Why lie about the lottery? Why let me believe I was lucky when I was—" He paused, searching for the word. "When I was actually—" He paused. "When I was actually a burden?" Norma stepped closer, closing the gap between them. She reached out and took his free hand. Her touch was warm, familiar, the only real thing in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked only at him, her eyes locking onto his with a ferocity that startled him. "Because you were proud, George," she said. "You were a Texas cowboy with too much pride and not enough money. If I had told you I sold my wedding ring, if I had told you I pawned the only promise we had to buy you a guitar, you would have made me go back and get it. You would have sold the guitar back. You would have taken that job at the feedlot. You would have quit." George stared at her, the truth of her words hitting him like a physical blow. She was right. He remembered the man he was in 1976. Stubborn, traditional, the kind of man who believed it was his job to provide, his job to put bread on the table and rings on fingers. If he had known his wife had stripped herself of her marital symbol to fund his pipe dream, his ego wouldn't have survived it. He would have folded. He would have given up the music to restore her honor. "You saved me from myself," George whispered, the realization dawning on him. "I didn't save you," Norma corrected him softly, a tear finally escaping and tracking down her cheek. "I invested in you. I knew who you were, George. I knew what was in your throat and in your heart. I knew that if you just had the tool, if you just had the chance, you would give us the world. And you did." George looked down at their joined hands. He looked at her left hand. On her ring finger sat a massive diamond, a rock he had bought her for their 30th anniversary. It was flawless, expensive, a symbol of his success and his wealth. It sparkled under the stage lights with a cold, brilliant fire. But suddenly, to George, it looked like glass. It looked like costume jewelry. It meant nothing. He looked back at the screen, at the blurry, grainy image of her bare hand on the pawnshop counter. That empty space on her finger in 1976, that was the real diamond. That absence was the most precious thing she had ever worn. He let go of her hand and took a step back. The crowd sensed the shift. The air in the arena grew heavy, charged with an emotional electricity that no song could ever generate. George Strait, the man who rarely showed emotion beyond a stoic smile, was unraveling. He reached up and took off his cowboy hat. It was a gesture of supreme respect, something a cowboy only does in church or in the presence of something greater than himself. He held the hat against his chest, over his heart. Then he did the unthinkable. George Strait, 71 years old, a living legend, lowered himself. His knees, worn from years of roping and riding, hit the stage floor with a dull thud. He didn't care about the pain. He didn't care about the crease in his jeans. He knelt before his wife in front of 20,000 people and the millions who would watch the footage later. A gasp tore through the arena. It was a sound of pure shock. Men didn't do this. Not men like George. Not here. Not now. Norma put her hands to her mouth, her eyes widening. "George, get up," she hissed,
embarrassed, trying to pull him up. "Please, get up." "No," George said into the microphone, his voice booming now, filled with a raw power that silenced her protests. "No, I need to be here. I need to be right here." He looked up at her, his blue eyes swimming with tears. He looked like a penitent sinner before a saint. "For 50 years," he began, his voice steadying, finding a rhythm in the heartbreak. "For 50 years, I walked around thinking I was the man of the house, thinking I was the one carrying the load. I stood on stages all over the world and accepted the applause. I took the awards. I took the money. I took the credit." He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat visible. "And all that time, you were walking in my shadow, carrying the secret that you had paid the toll for my passage. You walked around with a bare finger so I could have a full heart. You let me believe a lie because the truth was too heavy for me to carry." Norma was crying openly now, her shoulders shaking. She reached down to touch his face, but he caught her hand and kissed the palm. Then kissed the ring finger. Not the one with the big diamond, but the skin itself, the flesh and bone that had made the sacrifice. "I am a fraud, Norma," George said, the self-condemnation harsh and bitter. "I am a fraud financed by your pain. Every song I sang, every note I played on that Gibson guitar, it wasn't mine. It was yours. It belongs to you. I am standing here today, rich and famous, because you were willing to be poor and ashamed in a pawn shop in San Antonio." The camera operator zoomed in on his face. The image was projected onto the side screens, flanking the central image of 1976. The contrast was devastating. The young, desperate girl and the old, repentant man. George took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He shifted his weight on his knees, ignoring the discomfort. "I can't give you back that ring," he said, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. "I can't give you back the moment you took it off. I can't give you back the pride you swallowed when you handed it to that pawnbroker. I can't undo the 2 years you walked around feeling naked because I was too blind to see what you had done." He paused, looking out at the silent darkness of the arena, then back at her. "But I can ask for something I don't deserve." Norma shook her head, tears flying. "You don't have to ask for anything, George. You're my husband. I did it because I love you. There is no debt." "There is a debt," George insisted, his voice rising with passion. "There is a debt so big I can't pay it with money. I can't pay it with houses or cars or diamonds. I can only pay it with the rest of my life." He shifted the microphone to his other hand, freeing his right hand to reach into his pocket. But he didn't pull out a ring box. He didn't pull out a gift. He pulled out a guitar pick. A simple, white plastic guitar pick. He held it up. "This is the only tool I have," he said. "It's the only thing I know how to use. And I've been using it for me, for my career, for my glory." He looked at Norma, his gaze intense, burning with a renewed vow. "Norma, I am asking you to forgive me for being a blind fool. I am asking you to forgive me for the 50 years I didn't know. And I am asking you," he paused, his voice breaking again, "to let me spend every single second I have left on this earth trying to be half the man you thought I was in 1976. The crowd was weeping. Burly men in trucker hats were openly sobbing. Women were holding each other. It wasn't a concert anymore. It was a mass confession, a collective purging of every selfish act anyone in the audience had ever committed. Norma dropped to her knees as well. She couldn't stand looking down at him any longer. She collapsed onto the floor in her designer clothes, meeting him at his level. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. The microphone, caught between them, picked up her muffled sobs,
and the sound of George weeping into her hair. They stayed like that for a long time. Two elderly people huddled together on the floor of a massive stage, surrounded by millions of dollars of equipment, yet stripped of everything but their shared history. The band stood frozen in the shadows, some wiping their eyes. The video of 1976 continued to burn on the screen above them, a silent witness to the circle closing. Finally, George pulled back slightly. He kept his hands on her shoulders. He looked into her eyes, which were swollen but shining with a light that cut through the gloom. "I have to finish the show," he whispered to her, his voice intimate, meant only for her but heard by all. "But I can't play that guitar, not yet. It's too heavy right now." Norma smiled through her tears, reaching up to wipe a tear from his cheek with her thumb. "Then sing without it," she said. "Sing for me, just for me." George nodded. He helped her stand up, his movements gentle and protective. He didn't let go of her hand. He turned to the microphone stand, pulling it down to accommodate their position, but then decided against it. He stood up, pulling her up with him. The crowd erupted in a tentative applause, supportive but still stunned. George signaled to the band. He waved off the guitar tech who was rushing forward with the Gibson. "No," he mouthed. He turned to the pianist. "Just the keys," he said. "Give me an A." He turned back to the audience. He still held Norma's hand. He didn't let her leave the stage. He pulled her to the center, right next to him. "I was going to play a lot of hits tonight," George addressed the crowd, his voice weary but resolute. "I was going to play the rodeo songs and the drinking songs, but none of that makes sense right now." He looked at the photo on the screen one last time, the photo of the girl who sold her ring. "There's a song I wrote a long time ago," George said. "I never recorded it." "I never played it live, because I didn't think it was finished. I couldn't find the last verse. I thought it was just a sad song about a man who didn't know what he had." He squeezed Norma's hand. "I think I just found the last verse." The pianist began a soft, melancholic melody. It was simple, stripped back. George closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, letting the emotion of the last 20 minutes channel into his diaphragm. When he opened his mouth to sing, the voice that came out was different. It wasn't the polished voice of the king. It was the raw, gravelly voice of a husband who had just seen his wife's soul. He began to sing, not to the crowd, but to Norma. The lyrics were about a cowboy who lost his way in the storm, looking for gold in the mountains, while the real treasure was the fire burning in the hearth he left behind. He improvised, weaving the story of the pawn shop into the verses. He sang about the cold glass of the counter, the empty finger, the silent drive home. As he sang, the arena transformed. It felt like a campfire. It felt like a living room. The vast distance between the star and the fan evaporated. Everyone there thought of their own sacrifices, their own lies, their own loves. But the climax of the night was yet to come. George was building to a promise, a vow that would reshape the rest of his life, and he needed the world to witness it. The piano notes hung in the air like dust motes caught in a shaft of afternoon sunlight, fragile and shimmering. George's voice, stripped of all the studio polish, stripped of the reverb and the auto-tune that modern country stars relied on, was a jagged, beautiful thing. He sang the bridge of the improvised song, his eyes closed, his head tilted back as if he were trying to catch a glimpse of God in the rafters of the T-Mobile Arena. The lyrics he found in that moment were not rhymed perfectly. They didn't have the catchy hook of a radio hit. They were conversation. They were confession. He sang about the cold glass of the counter at Al's Pawn and Loan. He sang about the phantom weight of a ring that wasn't there. He sang about a man driving a truck, dreaming of stardom, while his wife sat at home rubbing a bare finger,
calculating the cost of his dreams in ounces of gold. Norma sat on the edge of the drum riser where George had guided her. She wasn't crying anymore. She was watching him with a look of profound, weary peace. The secret was out. The stone she had carried for 50 years had been rolled away, and underneath it she found not anger, but a deep, resonant gratitude. She watched her husband, the man the world called the king, deconstruct his own crown piece by piece, laying it at her feet. As the final chord of the song decayed into silence, George didn't move immediately. He let the silence stretch. It was a heavy, pregnant silence, the kind that usually exists only in church after a particularly convicting sermon. 20,000 people held their breath. No one checked their phone. No one went to the concession stand. The beer vendors in the hallways had stopped walking. The ushers stood frozen at the tops of the stairs. George opened his eyes. He looked drained, aged 10 years in 20 minutes, but his eyes were clear. He walked over to the guitar stand where the Gibson Dove, the lottery guitar, sat. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he picked it up. He didn't strap it on. He held it by the neck, walking back to the microphone. He held the guitar up, displaying it to the crowd, then turned and displayed it to the giant screen where the photo of 1976 still loomed. "I used to look at this guitar and see my luck," George said, his voice raspy. "I used to see a winning ticket. I used to see a blessing." He turned to Norma. "Now," he continued, "I look at this wood and I see your blood. I see your sacrifice. This isn't an instrument, folks. This is a receipt." He walked over to Norma and knelt again, not in apology this time, but in service. He placed the guitar gently at her feet. It was a surrender. He was giving up the symbol of his power. "I made a promise to myself a long time ago," George said, looking up at her, "that I would give you the life you deserved. I thought I did that. I bought the ranch. I bought the cars. I bought the diamonds." He gestured vaguely to the ring on her finger, the replacement ring. "But I never bought back what you sold. I never restored what you gave away." He stood up, turning to face the audience, his posture shifting. The slump of the broken man was gone, replaced by the steel spine of a cowboy who had a job to do. He looked fierce. He looked determined. "I have a new tour schedule," George announced. The crowd murmured, confused. "I know we have dates booked. I know we have contracts, and we will honor them. But my mission has changed." He pointed a finger at the ground, emphasizing every word. "I am going to find it." The crowd went silent again. "I don't care if Al's pawn shop has been closed for 30 years, George said, his voice rising, booming with the authority that had commanded stadiums for decades. "I don't care if that building is a parking lot now. I don't care if the records are dust. I am going to hire every private investigator, every historian, every tracer in the state of Texas." He walked to the edge of the stage, scanning the faces in the front row. "I am going to track down the ledger from November 1976. I am going to find the name of the person who bought that ring. It was a small ring, modest, gold band, tiny diamond, probably didn't cost more than $100 back then. But to me, it is the Holy Grail." He turned back to Norma, his hand over his heart. "I promise you, Norma, before I take my last breath, I will find that ring. I will buy it back. I don't care if it's in a jewelry box in Seattle or melted down into a bullion bar in London. If it's melted, I'll buy the bar. If it's lost, I'll sift the earth where it fell. I will spend the rest of my life trying to put the original ring back on your finger. Because that ring is the only thing I ever really owned. Everything else, all of this, He gestured to the arena, the lights, the stage. "All of this is just interest on the loan you gave me." Norma stood up. She walked to him, her face glowing with a mixture of amusement and overwhelming love. She took the microphone from his hand. "George," she said, her voice steady now, the voice of the matriarch. "You don't have to go chasing ghosts. I don't need the ring. I have you. That's what I bought. I bought you." The crowd erupted, a roar of approval that shook the foundations of the arena. It was a primal sound, a celebration of a love that transcended material things. But George shook his head, smiling through his tears. "I know, honey," he said, taking the mic back. "But a cowboy pays his debts, and I'm going to pay mine." He signaled to the band. "Boys," he said, "we can't end on a sad song, and we can't end on a party song. We have to end on the truth." He didn't pick up the Gibson. He left it at Norma's feet. He grabbed a simple acoustic guitar from the rack, a backup instrument he rarely used. He sat on the stool, pulling Norma to sit on the stool next to him. They looked like two teenagers on a front porch, not a superstar and his wife in a sold-out arena. "This is for the ones who pay the price so others can shine," George said. "This is for the wives who wait, the husbands who work double shifts, the parents who go without." He began to play the opening chords of "The Cowboy Rides Away." It was his signature closing song. Usually it was a triumphant, upbeat farewell. Tonight, he slowed it down. He played it as a waltz, a slow, mournful, yet hopeful waltz. "And my heart is sinking like the setting sun, setting on the things I wish I'd done." The lyrics took on a completely new meaning. The "things I wish I'd done" wasn't about a failed romance anymore. It was about the years of blindness. It was about the ring in the pawn shop. As he sang, the audience didn't scream. They didn't cheer. They sang. 20,000 people sang the chorus in a hushed, reverent unison. It sounded like a hymn. It sounded like a prayer. "Oh, the last goodbye's the hardest one to say, and this is where the cowboy rides away." George stopped playing the guitar for the final chorus. He let the crowd carry the melody. He turned to Norma. He took her left hand, the hand with the expensive diamond and the ghost of the cheap gold band. He brought it to his lips and kissed the empty space on her finger again. "I love you," he mouthed. "I know," she mouthed back. The song ended. There was no explosion of pyrotechnics, no confetti cannons, no smoke machines. Just the final vibration of 20,000 voices fading into silence. Then the applause began. It started slowly, a rumble in the upper decks. Then it grew. It wasn't the rhythmic clapping of a concert encore. It was the chaotic, thunderous noise of people who had been changed. People stood up, not just to stretch their legs, but to honor what they had seen. They were applauding the man, yes, but they were cheering for the woman. They were cheering for Norma. George stood up. He didn't bow. He took Norma's hand and raised it high in the air, like a referee declaring the winner of a heavyweight fight. He pointed at her. He kept pointing at her until the crowd understood. This wasn't his ovation, it was hers. The screams for "Norma, Norma" began to drown out the cheers for George. She looked embarrassed, hiding her face in his shoulder, but he wouldn't let her hide. He made her stand there and accept the love she had purchased 50 years ago with a small gold band. He leaned into the microphone one last time. "Good night, everybody," he said. "Go home and thank the person who believed in you before you believed in yourself." He put the microphone back on the stand. He didn't wave to the crowd. He turned to his wife. He offered her his arm, formally, like a gentleman courting a lady in 1976. She took it. They walked up the ramp toward the backstage darkness. The spotlight followed them, a single beam of white light cutting through the darkness. The band kept playing a soft instrumental loop, a gentle underscore to their exit. As they reached the curtain, George stopped. He looked back at the stage. The Gibson Dove was still lying on the floor where he had placed it. He didn't go back for it. He left it there, center stage, under the spotlight. He turned back to Norma, whispered something in her ear that made her laugh, a genuine, light-hearted laugh that reached the microphone even from that distance, and they disappeared behind the black velvet curtain. The house lights did not come up immediately. The stage remained dark, except for two things. The spotlight remained fixed on the guitar lying on the floor, the symbol of the debt, and the massive LED screen remained frozen on the image from 1976. The graininess of the photo seemed to have softened. The girl in the picture didn't look sad anymore. She looked strong. She looked like a woman who knew exactly what she was buying. The audience stayed. Minutes passed and nobody moved toward the exits. They stood in the afterglow of the revelation, staring at the photo and the abandoned guitar. Strangers hugged each other. Couples held hands tighter than they had in years. Finally, the screen faded to black, leaving only the text, "For Norma." And then, slowly, the house lights rose, revealing 20,000 people wiping their eyes, ready to go home and look for the gold they had buried in their own lives. The show was over, but the story of the ring and the hunt for it was just beginning.